How are you, man? How have you been?
Good. I brought a coffee. Yeah, I'm not sure what we're calling it these days, but it's a coffee builders chat. I thought I'd bring a coffee this time. Doing well. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. I brought tea, which I think is like not totally allowed.
Yeah, I'm a tea fan. I used to, in grad school, I had a lot of tea. Lived in England for a year where, yeah, just tea was definitely a thing. But yeah, now I'm more of a coffee man these days. I'm fairly addicted, I would say. I try to
Me
cut
too.
myself off at like noon, like no more coffee. But in the morning, like I have my most product kind of productive hours are like the first kind of few hours in the morning. I'd, sipping coffee and go get another one. So yeah,
And
good to be here.
is that before kids wake up or after kids wake up?
No, first it's like the kid zone, the flurry of like, getting two kids ready for school and, they're on time. And then I kind of drive into the office. I guess I can admit, I usually have like a 10-minute conversation with ChatGPT in the car on the way to work where I try to figure out like, okay, what is like, try to remember, what was I working on yesterday? Like, what's most important? So I kind of like get to the office already with some
Worked
kind of
up.
idea of like, okay, this is what I'm going to try to tackle. And I go kind of, the ritual of kind of brewing coffee and as a nice way to kind of just get in the right headspace. But yeah.
My best time of the day is before the kids wake up. So I'll get up early before them and I will make a cup of coffee and I will get about 90 minutes, sometimes 2 hours if they like are sleeping well.
Wow.
And if I'm gonna have a bunch of clods running at the same time, it's gonna be during that time in the morning. And
Okay.
anyway, that's my favorite time. And then the meetings and the rest of life kind of kicks in after the
I
kids
love
go to
that.
school.
It's
Yeah.
funny, like, yeah, when are your productive cloud hours? Because like they'll sort of work, whenever you set them off. But like, if we're kind of the bottlenecks, we have to kind of, yeah, when is it, are you in the right headspace to be able to kind of kick off, good tasks or review what they're doing? So yeah.
First thing in the morning is great, and then occasionally I pop the computer open at 8 o'clock at night. And then I have two really good hours. And I have like
Hmm.
30 like really rough minutes and then like 90 minutes where I should have gone to sleep but I can't.
Yeah.
Uh because you it feels so productive, but then at a certain point in time you start to actually like break down, right? Like you
Yeah.
just can't keep it you can't keep it going. I can't.
I was naturally a night owl, like in college. I would hang out with friends and then I would start problem sets at, midnight and finish them at 4 a.m. and, go to bed right as my roommate was like waking up to go surfing. And those were just like the most productive hours. And I just told myself I'm, yeah, not going to sleep until this is done. And that was kind of my natural rhythm. Not that it was that healthy. I think having a family has been like very healthy for me to just, it kind of forces you to kind of be more in like the morning rhythms of, school and
Sure.
everything. So it definitely has, like I'm still a little bit, ooh, let me just stay up like another hour. Like maybe I can, solve this problem or something. But yeah, you're right. I should probably just go to bed.
It's been tough like you know I we we have been chatting a little bit in our like side chat around bottlenecks and
Hmm.
uh it I find that I'm having to learn this rhythm of like forcing myself to actually sit down and like review interesting
Hmm.
things that are in flight. And I'm not quite as big on code review as I think you do more code reviewing than I do,
Hmm.
but I do like to do a lot of manual testing. I like to like actually
Hmm.
like
Sure.
see a change, touch the change, make sure that I like have felt it. And um I honestly feel like it's only been in the past month that I've actually like been able to figure out how I want to manage that work because it's just
Hmm.
it's so much faster than it was 3 months ago
Hmm.
that all of a sudden I'd have like 19 open pull requests that were now really
Yeah,
out of like the work got really disorganized. And the
totally.
bottleneck was me choosing to finish things, right?
Hmm.
Because it didn't feel as productive as the other stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like something's shifted for me, at least personally, in the last like 2 or 3 months, and it's not entirely clear. There's sort of not one obvious reason why. I remember the jump from like GPT 3.5 to 4 felt kind of big. We haven't had anything that's like felt that big, but it just feels this kind of like compounding effect of the models getting better, from like, Sonnet 4 to Opus 4.5 to now 4.6 yesterday, or like the new, GPT 5.3. The models are sort of better at reasoning and tool use. The harnesses are better. And a lot of it for me, I think, is actually just kind of tinkering and experimenting with my own workflows. And the
Mm-hmm.
issue, like I tend to, I sort of think quite a bit about what it might have been like in the kind of early era after electricity was discovered. And, I haven't read enough to really know, but it's just such an interesting thing that we discovered this kind of new, fairly general purpose technology that you could sort of convert energy produced in one way to like a way to consume it in some other way. And the thing I find most interesting about that period when you read about it is that it was sort of economically disappointing for a while. And the
Mm-hmm.
first like decade or two, like not much changed. People kind of just did what they were doing before. And we got electric lamps instead of kerosene lamps, or, my sister lives in West Orange, New Jersey, and yeah, that's where Thomas Edison had his big factory. And it was like really fascinating to visit because the whole factory was designed around this like central steam engine that drove this, huge belt, and there's a big, drive shaft, like. And so the first, and then, but right now it's like an electric engine. They just swapped out steam for the electric engine, but nothing actually changed. And I think it sort of took, rethinking how we design factories from scratch, which is probably kind of a scary thing to do if you're like a factory owner and you don't, it's risky. You haven't really figured it out yet. So I think that's kind of the phase that we're in. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm just like very much in a like kind of trying different things. But what it comes back to for me is like I'm always the bottleneck. Like no matter what I do, it's just like, oh cool, now there's more reviews back on me, or I have to figure out what's the next task, or this is kind of right, but I need to course correct this, or I'm testing. And so I think the more capable models get, like the worse that's going to be, right? I mean, it's like the more that they can do, the more I become the bottleneck. And so a lot of it for me is trying to figure out how do I get more of my intent out of my mouth or out of my mind to the models and not, just let them kind of, produce all this stuff. So that's where I've been kind of thinking lately.
Yeah, I love that. I love that meditation on that because I have heard that story before about how with electricity it was moving when you had a horse powering the factory, the like thing that the horse would walk around would be in the center. And at first they put the electricity generation in the center, and then at a certain point
Hmm.
it moved to the outside. But it wasn't until now that I sat and thought and sat that that I realize that we are moving the building out of
Hmm.
the center of the process, because if you think about particularly like at the beginning of when we were product managers, it was
Hmm.
extremely expensive to build software and you really did not want to
Yes.
be wrong, and you
Yeah.
obsessed over engineer. I mean, I worked at a company called AdRoll, which was like a growth stage company at the
Hmm.
time,
Sure.
and I would do anything to save an hour of
Hmm.
engineers' time, right?
Totally.
I would happily spend 4 hours of my time to spend
Yeah.
1 hour of their time, like not even a question. And
Right.
and I don't think that is how it is now for most things. I think that I do believe that architecture is still really important and having a good idea of
Hmm.
how you want to organize the work is still really important. But
Hmm.
actually, it's much more about what modeling the world. And if
Hmm.
I can be a little critical of the people that are saying software is dead, I do think that they underrate the degree to which requirements for what
Hmm.
software is built is an emergent process rather than like
Yeah.
many engineers that I worked with as a PM would it seemed like I could just sit down and like write the requirements doc.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I had one engineering manager who I deeply love, in particular, who would just be like, just write them down.
Hmm.
Um, and what I don't think that he realized is that yes, when I actually knew what I wanted to build, it took about,
Hmm.
an hour and a half to like write it down and dot the i's and cross the t's. But sometimes it took like a month to get to that hour and a half.
Totally.
There's like a lot of
Yeah.
work to get to that hour and a half. And now I really do think we're flipping. Like I think we're in a
Yeah.
world where like the old idea used to be like, understand, find your paying customer before you build anything, and now I think you're probably bringing like a working prototype in most cases. I know I am.
Yeah.
I'm bringing working
Totally.
prototypes to people. Yeah, so anyway.
I mean, I can go from like idea to concept in production code faster than like making a slide now. I have this little
Hmm.
internal gated area of our sort of startup. I call it concepts, and it's only
Hmm.
only visible to me, but it's like in our code base. And so what's nice is I think you're describing this process of kind of like diverging and then converging. And by
Yeah.
the time you get that sort of like doc written down that is ready to be consumed, you've actually done a bunch of diverging and you've had different divergent conversations with customers, or you've tried things, or you've and so, I go through these kind of diverge and converge loops. But I wonder, like, it'd be interesting to talk to like an economist or someone who'd studied that early electricity era, because, like, I wonder sort of like, why was the productivity gains initially disappointing, and then later, a decade or two in, I don't know how long it took, it actually turned out to be, very, kind of profound. And I think that we're kind of in that era now where I think a lot of people are sort of finding, like, honestly, kind of like disappointing productivity improvements from AI. Like you might have like added, GitHub Copilot in your organization, and you probably sped up some things. But if the bottleneck moves somewhere else, you actually don't really see much of a win.
Mm.
And when I think about that Thomas Edison factory, like I don't know, but my hunch of sort of what was happening is when you have a centrally designed factory, it creates a certain rigidity where you're not able to kind of move things around as much. And if you think about kind of the assembly line and like, when what happened once they got rid of that big central steam engine or electricity engine and they moved it to just like there's wires overhead and you can kind of just plug in individual machines and there's like a tool and die maker over here or someone else with this machine over there, you can move those things around depending on what you're kind of trying to manufacture. And I see this sort of like software development life cycle that we've, all kind of learned and developed over the last few decades as being this kind of rigid process that was based on the assumptions that we didn't even know how to question. Like I just, when I started as a PM, I dropped out of like math grad school and I was like, they're like, you're a PM. I'm like, what is a PM? I was like, I had like super imposter. I was just like, oh no, I have to like figure out what people are supposed to build. How do I do that? But they're like, oh, there's this thing called like a product requirements document, and here's the like template. And it's like this long document. My wife was at, Microsoft, and their PRD was like 100-page Word doc because you had to describe things in such detail that then the engineers could build it and test it because it's going to go on like a CD-ROM that gets shipped and you can't, there's no takebacks. And so
Right.
I think what I see happening now is that like we've kind of broken the old model, but we haven't really yet figured out how to put the pieces back together. And the
Mhm.
assumption that like writing software is really expensive is sort of not true anymore. But yeah, like specifying requirements, like testing them, making like correct software, secure software, like it's still very hard. And there's a social element to it. Do we even agree on what we want? That's always going to be hard.
Mhm.
But somehow we need to figure out how do we move things around in the factory kind of based on what we're doing and our needs. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm working at a company right now that is selling into a lot of defense and aerospace places. And
mhm,
there's a feature, I'm not working on this feature, but I've been close enough to be able to kind of see it being developed. And I would argue that there is no one in the world who knows what the requirements are for it. There are
mhm.
people that understand individual pieces of those requirements, but what we're trying to
Yeah.
build is novel enough and requires enough interaction that actually the requirements are being discovered and are like emergent. They don't exist.
Mhm,
There is no source of
mhm,
truth. There's no one person that you could go find. It's one of the things that
mhm.
makes me think that there will probably still be a role for humans in software development, even
Oh,
as
sure.
things,
Yeah.
I mean, sure, you can imagine like an omniscient being that could bring those things in, but
A
but
magical wizard.
yeah. A
We'll just have
smuggled
the wizard do it
infinity.
all.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
We
yeah,
won't even
yeah,
tell it what we want, but
yeah,
the wizard will somehow magically read our minds and build it all for
yeah.
us.
Yeah, but and then another thing, I'll drop this in. It's an old blog post of mine that is about the machine gun and about the process of adopting the
Yes.
machine gun. And what I appreciated about this one, and why I keep coming back to it, is that the writer in this case went and studied the social history and studied the
Hmm.
way that
Hmm.
different people could have veto points effectively over whether or not the machine gun got adopted, and that it
Hmm.
wasn't enough to just have the technology. You needed the technology to exist. You needed people to be
Hmm.
trained on it and to have access to it. He tells stories where there would be regiments that had no bullets for their machine gun, so they never got trained on
Hmm.
how to use it. Right?
Hmm.
You then need to evolve your tactics, and which comes out of the training, and it also changes your culture because
Hmm.
the culture of the military's up until the machine gun was to get in straight lines and charge
Hmm.
together in order to break the enemy line, and that no
Hmm.
longer works. But now you're having to you're taking the things that matter most to people that have been grained into them over time and saying, actually, you don't
Hmm.
need to do that anymore. And there are people that absolutely get the machine gun that struggle to make that like mental leap,
Hmm.
because it's hard.
Yeah,
It's
totally.
hard.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think we're all struggling with this right now. I mean, I'm now at a 3-person company and we're all just trying to figure out how, first it was just me and my little 10 cloud agents. Now we hired another engineer. He's awesome. And now there's like two of us with our little cloud agents. And we're like, okay, how do we not have them stepping on each other? Which things should, which instructions maybe are just my personal preferences, which should be in the team. But, and the bigger an organization you are, the more kind of like coordination, headwind you have, and sort of
Yeah.
people with different incentives. And I think there's something about this bottlenecks thing where
Mm.
I think this is maybe what leads to some of the disappointment where you get this sort of like early hype cycle where whether it's like the transistor or the early internet, fiber optic cables, early mobile, and like often there's something, sometimes it's just hype, but like often there's
Mm.
some real thing, but like people sort of get sort of overly excited, a lot of capital flows in, you sort of hear all of this hype, and then there's this period of disappointment where you're like, well, wait a minute, we're spending all this money on AI, like what are we really? How much is this really helping us as an organization? And then you kind of go through these like troughs of despair. And I think partly what's probably happening is just like this idea, Ethan Mullick and kind of a jagged frontier that like
Mm.
there are no best practices, there are no experts. We're all sort of figuring it out individually. But then as you start to kind of try to adopt things as bigger groups of people, my team or my organization, it just
Mm.
takes time. I think the sort of like
Mhm.
organizational diffusion of knowledge and tactics, kind of what you're talking about, just take longer than the technologists always kind of think it will
Well,
take.
the team is going to pin things that you're they're gonna there's gonna be a coordination mechanism, and then there's gonna be rules, right? Like we all do
Hmm.
code review, right? It
Hmm.
might be one of those rules, right? Well, so then even if you personally are at the frontier and you're like, I hear some engineers that I really respect say, "Hey, I don't do code reviews anymore."
Hmm.
Um, you probably, unless you're like pretty disagreeable, not gonna like just flout your team in that way,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And so then that acts as and then organizations have that problem at scale, right? Because they're also are
Hmm.
gonna have their own sets of rules, and it makes it really challenging. I know I find myself using AI differently in my personal projects and
Hmm.
finding ways to erode bottlenecks than I do in my corporate ones
Hmm.
because
Totally different
the
norms, different
situation is different.
constraints.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I still do code reviews. I mean, it's an interesting question. Like, I tend to use Git as like my gate between AI's never allowed to add anything to Git, and sometimes I tell it to. It's like never do this, but even sometimes it'll like I'll like catch it. Be like, wait, why'd you? Don't do that. This is like the gate for me. So I'm always kind of reviewing, often in parallel. But it's interesting that you know people that have sort of are no longer doing that. And I don't, I'm not, I don't, I'm kind of open-minded about it. I imagine it's a little bit like the period, that when they wrote like the first C compilers
Mhm.
and everybody, who's using them, they all were probably like experts in like assembly language. And wait, now there's this higher level thing that
Mm.
sort of compiles down. And at first, before you learn to trust the compiler, you would probably go and read the output and you'd be like, and you would probably find compiler bugs. You'd be like, wait a minute, like, I still
Mhm.
got to really kind of hold on to the reins here. I'm not ready to like trust this thing. But at some point, if that compiler sort of gets better and better and you start to kind of trust it in real world situations, I imagine at some point you kind of start to let go of the reins. Like, okay, I can now sort of move up the ladder of abstraction and sort of understand the C code. And I trust that if there's a bug in the code, it's like a bug in my code, not like the compiler code. And we're in that period today. I'm not ready yet to like let it commit things without me, kind of reviewing it. And I also just like to understand the code base. Like it helps me kind of like load up my own mental model. But one thing I haven't done, which I think you have done maybe, is like figured out how to hook like a browser up with one of these MCP things. I still haven't done that, but like for me, it's all about can I verify can I have the agent verify that like it's doing what I want it to do. And so
Mhm.
code review for me is still there, partly because I don't have enough other like verification mechanisms to say like, did you actually do it? Like, don't stop until you're done.
Yeah, this is great. So my workflow right now, and we'll say for a feature that has like a medium degree of UI change complexity, is I normally have that running on Claude Code locally.
Hmm.
I may start the PRD in the like Claude Code web interface, but at a certain point when I'm ready to have it build, I get that branch set up locally and I get that running. And then at a certain point in time, I will tell Claude Code to use the Chrome Dev MCP tools, and it
Hmm.
will then pop up and start to. It creates a little Chrome browser, and I can actually see it working. And
Hmm.
it will run through. Sometimes I have that in the forefront and I watch it. Sometimes it's kind of in the corner of my eye. Sometimes I even hide it because I'm just like, you go and do it.
Hmm.
Like, let me know when you're done. Um,
Hmm.
and then the other thing that I've been doing a lot on projects is trying to enable my agent to be able to debug. So
Hmm.
having APIs that allow it visibility into the system so that it can see, it can at least tell me that the API response is correct and that there's a bug in the
Hmm.
UI. Like that really, really helps in terms of
Hmm.
narrowing things
Hmm.
down.
Hmm.
Having it be able to both manage a production environment versus a a local environment. And then in my
Hmm.
latest project where I'm spending most of my time right now, it has its own like mini app, which is its own
Hmm.
directory. It's like I've called it slash ops, and in
Hmm.
there there's a .in file. There's a place for it to put its helper scripts, and there's
Hmm.
documentation to both the production APIs and then the local APIs. And
Hmm.
that has actually been one of the most helpful things because I can tell it go read. I'm seeing a bug on this object. Go trace the flow of creating that object,
Hmm.
and oftentimes it finds stuff. Anyway, that's been one of my best hacks.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, okay. You've mentioned this to me a couple times, so I keep saying after my calls with James, I'm gonna need to go figure out how that like browser MCP thing works. But I mean, I'm still a little bit too much of a router. Like if you think about it, what we're trying to do is like, get the agent to do something I want it to do, but then often it's not, often it doesn't just like one shot it exactly, right? So then I like need to give it more information. And so I'm still a little bit too much of a like copy paster of like, oh, there's a stack trace. Let me copy that for you and put it over here. Oh, let me take a screenshot of what's janky and like show it to you. And so like I'm just using like the clipboard and screenshot, like, two of the best like, interfaces we've ever come up with. And I'm still like kind of the router between it. I just haven't actually gotten over the hump of like, let me just show you the browser so I can stop, being this like
Well,
copy paste monkey.
so the other thing I've done is I now use Claude code exclusively in skip permissions mode. I have
Okay.
optimized my main computer such that I am okay if everything on that computer gets deleted. So I've had my
Hmm.
basically I went through and I was like the only digital stuff that I really care about here are my photos. So let me make sure that
Hmm.
my photos are
Hmm.
backed up and that this computer could get tossed into the ocean and I wouldn't care. Okay, cool.
Hmm.
Um, and then I have my GitHub main branch protected, and
Hmm.
so it creates pull requests for me. And then I am just
Hmm.
like, let her
You're
rip.
living dangerously. I love it. All right.
Well, I
Security
got
people, cover
sick.
your eyes. But
I need,
yeah.
yeah. Well, it's not. This is my personal. I should say this is my personal computer. This is
Yeah,
not.
yeah. Makes
I
sense.
I,
It's
I
cool.
am responsible for the mistakes that happen here, and will feel the
Hmm.
pain, not somebody
Yeah.
else. Um, but I need to try Conductor again. I know you've been a big Conductor person to see if they figured out work trees better. But the last time I used it, it was too hard for me to get um, to get changes and then to be able to verify that locally before I
Yeah.
sent it up. And um, so then I just was like, all right, well, I'm just going to use a bunch of terminal windows and I'll organize them
Yeah.
such that
I mean, what I
um,
love is like there's no right answer here. People just, I mean, just as like, developers have always had different preferences for IDEs, or some people like Emacs or Vim or, whatever. I like Conductor. I mean, there's nothing magic there, but like there is something about like work trees, just making them very cheap to spawn. And I
mhm.
tried at one point like writing some scripts that I didn't really understand about how to like, add and delete work trees. I just didn't have like a good workflow for it.
Yeah.
So for me, one thing that's kind of funny is just I think I still use a lot of the same keyboard shortcuts I've been using for decades, but like the objects have grown much larger. And so I
Mhm.
use Conductor. I don't even pay for Conductor. They should figure out how to charge me. I use it like many hours a day, but it just uses my Claude Code like, login basically. So or my
Yeah.
basically I can swap across like Anthropic or OpenAI, and I do like to use both of
Yep.
those models. And just like when they release new ones, I like to be able to switch. I think the
Mhm.
new Codex desktop app probably does kind of very similar things. It's just only OpenAI, and I kind of want to not be tied in. And so
Mm.
for me, Conductor, if I just do like Apple N, or I just say like plus, it spawns a whole Git work tree. It runs my setup script that copies my envars over. Like I basically just get like a whole workspace ready to go. And then, I can sort of spawn multiple chats so I don't work in there. And some of them just get archived. Sometimes it's like, hey, there's a research task or planning, just like archive. So it's like very cheap to kind of spawn a thing, do things, and then just archive. But then some of them graduate into like, okay, now I'm going to start reviewing the code. And the thing I like about it is it keeps the sort of like inner loop fast, where like,
Mhm.
if I do Command O for open, it opens a whole cursor window for me. So now I can actually see the code. I tend to review in my IDE. I'm like maybe tweaking there. I'm committing there. So I do my
Mm.
code reviews in cursor. I could fire up like a dev server and test in my browser. So the inner loop's very fast, but then I still am doing what you're doing. I mean, when it's ready to sort of commit, I say, okay, create a PR that goes to GitHub. We have like preview environment set up there. I can actually, go and click in there and actually, test it there as well. But it starts in this very fast sort of like cheap local workflow for me.
Did you write the script that copies your environmental variables over, or does that come out of the box with Conductor?
I had Claude write it for me, but yeah,
Okay.
Conductor has a feature. Though it was initially that was like one of the pain points where it was like, oh, I spawned this thing, but where are my environment variables? Do I pull them from Vercel? Where do I get them? So it's like a 5-line bash script that I think just yeah, it's part of it's like there's like a dot conductor
They've
folder in my
productized that
main
now.
repo.
Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
so
yeah,
some way to
yeah.
do it. So I think I dumped the docs in and I was like, hey Claude, like I want to copy Anvar's over in this, this part of the monorepo and that one. And so that just kind of happens automatically. If you have other sort of setup stuff you need to do, I think most of these tools have some way to kind of run like a setup script basically.
I was a super early conductor adopter and it didn't have that and I just ran into that too many times and I at that point hadn't wasn't thinking like have Claude do this for me. It was like, oh, I have to do this, and I
Hmm.
just was like, couldn't do it.
Totally.
But that's good to know. Do you have any other like bottleneck breaking uh, ideas or?
Yeah, I mean, what's funny is like I'm the bottleneck, and I always have been, I always will be. Like, every time I kind of try to make myself more productive, like I just become the bottleneck again. And I think one thing I think people should maybe think more about that I don't hear people discuss as much is like, how do we express more intent back to the agents? Because
Mhm.
I hear these stories about people running like, what is it, Ralph Wiggum or one of these things like overnight, and I haven't really had success with that. I know some people are bullish on it, like but for me, it's like it's unlikely I have like expressed enough of my intent that I would
Mhm.
want you to run overnight and use a bunch of tokens. If I review in the morning, like, did I give you enough instruction that that's going to be like in good shape? Like, probably not. And
Mhm.
so a lot of my bottleneck focus right now is like, how do I get more out? And so I use voice quite a bit, and it's awkward. And
Mhm.
like, I'm in like a working space, and I don't really use it in the office now. So I'll go get like a phone booth, and I'll hold function, and I'll just blather, 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 because I could just get so much like just giant paragraphs of text out. It doesn't matter if there's typos. It's about like communicating information about my intent more quickly. And sometimes it's like when I kick off a task, let me give you a big brain dump. Sometimes it's like, okay, I'm reviewing code and it's faster for me to like read through it and just talk so that it can go in the course correct. So voice for me has been an unlock. And then the other one is like a little bit of parallelism. I can't handle more than about three things at once in my head, but like having either two or three work trees or two chats within a work tree where when I kick something off and that might work for 5 or 10 minutes, I can flip over to the other one and I can review and kind of give feedback. And so it's kind of that unblocking thing you talked about. Like when we were PMs, it was like, okay, if I have 2, 3 engineers, just like how do I keep them unblocked? And so those are kind of the main tricks I've kind of been just practicing so far.
Dude, I love it. Can we switch gears to talk about guardrails? Because I feel like
Sure.
you are out ahead of me on how you're setting up guardrails. Like, what are you doing? Yeah, talk to me about it.
Yeah, I mean, this is an idea I've been kind of like nerding out about for, I guess, I don't know, a year or two, just as I've been, yeah, I kind of went through the arc of like trying to use code. First, just kind of copy pasting from ChatGPT. Okay, then Claude Code. And I think one thing I learned just like pretty early is the importance of constraints and kind of making the environment strict. And so I had a couple blog posts about this in the past where I talked about sort of quality gates and in my sort of Claude MD file, or if you have a cursor rules, whatever sort of way you instruct the agent, one thing I found quite early was like define this little section called quality gates, and ideally even like put those like a script. So I have a little script, I just call it like npm check, and that runs everything. That runs my type checker, it runs my linter, it runs the formatter, and I want to sort of load that up almost with like as many like strict checks as I can. And then I just have to tell the agent, hey, like, if you think you're done, make sure you run this. And it catches stuff all the time. And so like it just when it runs that, it's what it's doing is it's sort of feeding information back from the environment to the agent so it can sort of course correct. And so this idea of kind of guardrail coding is something I've been thinking about. So I used since we were having a chat today, I was like, I should probably like go and write something up about guardrail coding because I keep talking about it. So I wrote up a little blog version of it today, but it's I think others are sort of having similar thoughts. But to me, I never want to vibe code the environment. I never like in a way I think of like guardrail coding as like the opposite of vibe coding.
Mhm.
And Andre Karpathy, he just had like a follow-up tweet. Like he tweeted about vibe coding like about a year ago. And there's something so fun about vibe coding. Like I do it with my daughter, like we make little games. I don't look at the code at all. It's like when you have like no constraints, that's what makes it so fun. You can just move like super fast.
Mhm.
But then, and I think in a lot of like real software teams, we just have constraints. You have a legacy code base, you have, libraries using certain specific versions, you have a design system, which is all about constraints, you have
Mhm.
organizational constraints. And I think that we haven't really yet figured out, enough ways to kind of make these constraints legible to agents. And we're moving to this world where, agents are writing a lot of this code,
Mhm.
but they don't actually understand like what the constraints are. So if you hired like a new hire and you had them join and you just say, hey, go do this task, you didn't actually tell them any of these constraints, like you wouldn't be surprised if they came back and, oh, I forgot to tell you, kind of like you're missing some context here. And that's kind of the era that we're in. So I just think
It's
guardrail
also,
coding.
I have just joined a team,
Hmm.
and I think it's a great organization. I have nothing bad to say. They do a fantastic job at documenting like the most granular level of
Mm.
like how things work both in the code and within the organization. But then there's a like meta conversation about like, oh, what's it is this review meeting actually used for? So they
Hmm.
can tell me here are the important meetings and here's who attends
Hmm.
those meetings, but it's almost never written down like how to actually use that meetings. And it's actually very is it like a lot of cognitive overhead for them
Hmm.
and I noticed this pattern in my documentation of my code as well, and I wonder how much of that is just human. Like it's hard to
Hmm.
actually figure out how to move from that lower level to like that like meta level.
Totally.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's sort of interesting now, I mean, more like a practical tip, it depends on your code base, but I think like the tooling has gotten so much better. Like in Python, like UV is kind of like I was always sort of baffled by all the sort of different ways that, Python tooling worked. And like,
mm,
that's just like a very fast, kind of nice, tool in the Python ecosystem. In JavaScript land, the tooling has just gotten much better and faster recently. So
mm,
I upgraded, I use TypeScript and they have a new sort of TS Go where the Microsoft team, I think, is like rewriting TypeScript and Go. So it's like way faster. There's
mm,
this like Ox, what is, I don't, I'll not do it justice, OXC, like the Ox sort of tool chain where people are writing, in Rust, like formatters and linters. So I used to use ESLint and Prettier, and it might take like 10, 15, 20 seconds to run my checks on like a big
mm,
monorepo, and I upgraded, and now it's like, the type checker takes maybe a second or two, and then
mm.
the linter is like 20 milliseconds. And so it's like, okay, if you can lint in 20 milliseconds and I have a bunch of cores, like I could just run a whole bunch of custom lint rules in
mm.
parallel in basically 20 milliseconds and give that information back. And so one of the ways
So
that I think about it, yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
I was gonna say how talk me through this. Like, okay, I've got a TypeScript app. Let's say I want to do this. What am I using? What is this keeping from happening? Or what is this protecting me from? And then how do I get to like hello world on it?
Yeah, I mean, so that you can start with the type checker. So the type checker is really just checking that, like, I mean, you could think of it as like the compiler, I guess, in the sort of earlier days, we would have called it compiler, but that's just checking, like, is your code even valid, or is it just going to like
Mm,
crash and like cause a problem? JavaScript would have happily let you ship that to production and you would find out later, but like TypeScript, at least, like, I'll never sort of write in like an untyped language again, just because like typing just
mm,
saves so many issues and I don't need like a million unit tests. So you start with the type checker. Then what a linter is it's like it's sort of ratcheting down the strictness further.
mhm,
And so it's things that are like technically valid, but like maybe cause issues. So React, for example, there's just a lot of foot guns that,
mm,
if your dependency array isn't quite right, like it's easy to overlook and you might get a sort of subtle, state issue or race
mm,
condition or something. And it'll sort of flag those. Or let's say you care about accessibility.
mhm,
TypeScript itself isn't going to enforce that, but you can add like a standard, accessibility pack that other people have written who they've gone and read all the accessibility standards, they've encoded it in a set of rules that you can check. And so, if you use an
mm,
image and you don't have an alt tag, then like screen readers won't be able to understand it and it'll flag that. And so
mm.
in the past, we added these kinds of things to give feedback to, us as developers, that we would see this in our IDE as like a little squiggle and we would sort of manually fix it. But now it's even better because like, I don't even have to
Mm.
see the squiggles. The squiggles sort of almost show up. The AI gets that information, and like my accessibility just gets kind of fixed before I even ever see the
Hmm.
code. So and you can write custom rules as well. I'm still kind of figuring out like what kinds of things you can express as kind of custom lint rules, but it seems to be a pretty powerful way to say, let me express this constraint in my environment, not just like, put it in my prompt and sort of hope for the best.
How can you give me an example of a custom lint rule that you feel like has been like successful?
Yeah, I'm kind of still figuring this out. So I was just playing with like in the example I gave in the blog post that I was writing up this morning. I mean, we're using like I have a new startup with my wife where we're basically taking this idea and trying to apply it to like enterprises that have, like
Mm,
lot of sort of existing constraints. And
mm,
so, one of the things that comes up when you want it to code in like my company's design system, not, some generic looking tech stack. One sort of simple example is things like colors and, theming and styling that you might
mm,
say, like our current customers, these are like consultants who are building like, custom apps on top of Workday's platform, but they might be building it for, a certain customer, then maybe they want it to be branded like the customer. Like, the design systems tend to create a lot of constraints. I'm like, what are you allowed
Hmm.
to change?
Hmm.
And so, you could try to put that in your prompt. I think that's where a lot of people are today. They're almost like trying to write these sort of like Uber prompts of like, let me see if I
Hmm.
can like get Claude Code or whatever tool we're using to like respect all these constraints. It like kind of works, but it's this kind of game of whack-a-mole. And so if you can express instead, hey, never use a custom hex color. If I see like a 6-digit hex color, like you're doing something wrong. It needs to be like the approved tokens in our
Mm.
design system or our brand colors, things like that. I think you can express as like a
I
lint
think
rule
it's
that
like
just checks it.
anytime you're writing never into
Hmm.
your prompt, you should probably instead have a hard check mechanism that then bounces it back to the agent. Is that like a good, is that should be my like
I think
guardrail?
if it could be expressed, and what I'm still trying to figure out is what kind of things can you express? But I think,
Okay.
it's like one way to think of it is, you can use AI as an interpreter or as a
Hmm.
compiler. So using it as an interpreter is kind of what we're mostly doing, is that we give instructions and it sort of interprets it every single time.
Hmm.
If there's a way that we can sort of like compile that intent instead to something stricter, that's
Hmm.
better. You can't always do it. But it
Hmm.
reminds me also a little bit, like this is a very common thing in computing, that you might sort of decide when do you want to kind of pay the cost of some computation. And so in React, React started in the browser and it's like rendering every time in the browser. And then we sort of figured out, let's pull it up to the server, and then we can sort of render on the server and send less down to the browser. And then sometimes you can pull it even into the build. And so you can actually just use it to sort of build a static site, and then, you'll never
Hmm.
pay that cost again. But not everything can be static. So if you have a highly interactive site, okay, maybe those parts still need to go down to the browser. But if you can pull it up, it's often nice. And so that's how I think of it, is like, if you want to express constraints on what agents do, you can do it in prompt space and it'll
Hmm.
probably work, and it's easy to get started. So you should probably start there. But if you
Hmm.
can sort of shift from prompt space into environment space in some way, like you have, lint rules or some other way that you can check, it's a nice
Hmm.
shift to make, because now, you're no longer sort of depending on this sort of, non-deterministic interpreter every time reading this rule. You're asking it to pay attention to a lot of things at once. You get it in 20 milliseconds. It costs you nothing. There's no tokens. And so, but not everything can be shifted. So I'm still trying to build intuition about like, how do we shift from prompt space to environment space and sort of move our, that's what guardrail coding is to me. Like, vibe coding is like turn off all the
Hmm.
guardrails and like, let's fly. It's like super fun. Like, but then you're like, oh, I built a thing. And then your engineering team's like, well, we can't ship that. You know that, right? Or the design team's like, why does this look like nothing like our site? And so guardrail
Hmm.
coding is like, let's load up the environment. So then you can still have the fun of the, like, just, talking about my intent, but I sort of get all of those constraints from the environment. So that's the idea.
I love that. I need to think. So my goal for the week is going to be to find one thing, one environmental guardrail that I can put into place
Mm.
to, because right now I'm totally in. I guess I have Claude automatically run npm build to
Hmm.
actually
Yeah,
make sure that
that's an
make sure that
example.
it builds. But it's like that's the only thing. Everything
Right.
else is just like let her rip. And actually, I mean, I feel kind of the same way about people talk about like the really long running like agent sessions, and I've never
Hmm.
had that. But I think part of that is because I can't express the features that I'm trying to
Hmm.
build in terms of like tests that like when these
Right.
things are true, this is I'm ready to review this. Instead, I'm kind of like I want to have this like conversation and then I want to
Right.
read it. It's very like that. So it's probably another way that if that it's probably a skill you can learn. It's like
Hmm.
translating your thoughts into testable yes no outcomes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that if the sort of bottleneck moves from coding to, requirements up front and then verification at the end, like, I mean, even like me and, my current team, we're spending a lot. I'm basically trying to spend as many tokens as I can. I know that sounds kind of insane, but I'm just sort of like trying to figure out, like, as an engineer, how could I spend, yeah, I'm sure I maxed out my Claude plan, but like, how could I spend 1,000 or 5,000 of tokens every month and figure out how to actually use that productively as like a good thought
Hmm.
experiment? But I'm still spending them mostly on the generation side, and then I'm still doing a lot of like manual testing, code reviews, some things. But I kind of feel like in order to scale it, like I should be probably spending quite a bit of tokens on the verification, which could be, smoke tests every time, a PR builds on Vercel. Maybe I should actually kind of go run a bunch of tests there, like things that just would give me more confidence to kind of be able to review and merge things more quickly. But yeah, when I hear these stories about people are like running things for weeks, I think Cursor built a browser, like Anthropic, they just did some sort of like C compiler yesterday. Like, those seem like cases where there's like a giant kind of test suite that's already there where you can sort of, what does it mean to be a browser? Well, you have to understand HTML and CSS. There's like a whole suite of stuff you can run, or like, the GCC compiler, there's probably got like a huge test suite. And so those seem to be the cases I've seen where, okay, I can kind of see what it means to like run for a week because you have this giant test suite. But if you don't have one, yeah, I tend to like to kind of check in more often and not let it get too far ahead of itself.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I wonder, it would be interesting to see if we could chat with anyone from those teams and find out the degree to which that they had those requirements up front. And to some extent, it's an existing thing in the world, so you can kind of, once it exists, it's much easier to articulate the requirements than it is the other way around.
Hmm.
But I do suspect that some of that I'll try that this week as well. Is like one project where I can flip it around and say when this is true, you're ready to like show me a test branch and like
Hmm.
go and do. One other thing I'll show you. This is in my like experimental bucket. So what I started to do this week was actually switch. So this is once upon a time this was an app that where
Hmm.
the root directory was kind of the same. And at some point this week, I decided that actually what I needed to do here was think of it the like business or organization that I'm building here
Hmm.
as a like mono repo. And so
Hmm.
then the app is down here in this web app
Hmm.
that's like where most of the stuff gets served. But I also have this
Ooh, a
like
business directory. Yeah, cool.
a business
Hmm.
directory. So this has it started with
Hmm.
just my PRDs, but like now I've got these kind of these friction logs that have been popping up. I've got some of
Hmm.
the customer conversations I've been having. I've got some of the admin stuff around
Hmm.
what I'm doing. And this is my ops agent that can go and like
That's
it
cool.
does some debugging for me. And so I'm breaking them out so that there's some separation between the two because where this came from was actually you when you the last time we chatted said to me think about compounding
Hmm.
and how to
Hmm.
make things compound. And so I then would
Hmm.
step back and thought, okay, well, my limiting factor here is actually at this point probably not my feature set. Like
Hmm.
for what I understand, I feel pretty good about that feature set. My limiting
Hmm.
factor is A, finishing features,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
B, like customer conversations and outreach. And so I'm trying to like
Hmm.
organize that stuff. What I'm going to try to do this week is start to get it to the point where Claude can provide me with sample outreach emails, and
Hmm.
then I'll approve them, and then it will do actually the send using some of the like developer tools. Anyway, so that's
That's
another
cool,
place where
man.
I'm trying
Yeah.
to. Yeah. I'm trying.
That could be a nice future conversation. Yeah, kind of how to use. I've been using Claude Code a little bit to make like little sourcing agents and stuff. Probably not ready to share them, but yeah, I think there's sort of like Claude Code for other parts of your business is actually like a pretty interesting conversation to have as well.
Where this came from, one of the projects that I'm working less on right now, but it is kind of floating around, it's a local newspaper for the city of Roswell, which is where I live.
Hmm.
And there are these features that I'm not. So most of what happens for it is automatically run by LLMs in the cloud. I get documents,
Hmm.
I process those documents, LLMs write summaries. But I've got
Hmm.
this people feature. And it's kind of interesting. I get the people's names from the documents. It does a really good job of that. It gets their job titles, but I haven't had the time yet to actually like set up and evaluate like
Hmm.
descriptions of them. But what I can do really, really easily is tell my Claude agent, go find
Hmm.
this person object, go do a web search on them,
Hmm.
and write up and also like look at the documents and give me a passable summary. It does a good job
Hmm.
like 8 out of 10
Hmm.
times, and I can yes no
That's
it
cool.
before it writes it.
Hmm.
And I can do that in the background, right? And so it's not
Hmm.
totally it's like it's very low cost. Anyway,
Right.
it's another way I'm trying to
Very
just
cool.
burn tokens. So
I have a parting thought for you. I guess we're
yeah,
coming up on what 45 minutes. Okay. So last that's a weird one. I like to kind of like yeah,
let's
half
end on a
baked
weird
idea.
note.
So a lot of what I do these days is I go back and I try to find like oldie but goodie ideas from computer science from like long ago, from like, wise folks that came way before us and like figure out how do they apply to like, kind of what's going on now. So, compilers or John McCarthy's Lisp paper, like there's kind of these kind of classics in the sort of CS canon. And just this week, as I was thinking about bottlenecks, I've kind of talked about, how do I get more information out, not just focus on what's coming back. It reminded me of this. There's a great, like, Claude Shannon, he's kind of the father of information theory. and he talks about sort of like how do you measure information that's like sent over a channel. So you and I are communicating right now, and we're communicating with some audience. And what does it mean to kind of what is information? And he talks about basically that it's kind of like surprisal. If I tell you a message that it's completely predictable. If I start to say, "Hey James," and you knew I was going to say that, you didn't actually get information. If I tell you something surprising, that information was sent. And so the weird world that we find ourselves in now is we're not used to thinking about our tools in this way. We don't like communicate to our hammer, or like if I'm in a factory, we've
Mm,
built other interfaces to like use our tools. We've been tool builders for a long time, but our tools never understood English. And so the weird thing that is happening is like, I mean, I'm not making a philosophical statement. I don't know whether you want to call it communication or not, but like I'm using English to tell Claude what to do,
mhm.
and then it does stuff, and then I do it again. And so I think we should kind of think about like, one of the ways that Claude Shannon defined information was like reducing uncertainty. And so if I
Mm,
say go build a settings page, I haven't given you enough information. There's a lot of uncertainty about what I might mean. And so I think just thinking about like, how do I reduce uncertainty in what I might mean? More intent, more blather, more voice, more guardrail checks, more various
mm,
ways to just reduce the uncertainty about my intent. And then these things are already way capable, they're much more capable of building than we're sort of currently giving them. So anyway, just I think that's like, I don't know what to make of it, but I'm like, there's a weird thing going on where there's this kind of like two-way information going back and forth, and I'm the bottleneck. So that's yeah, maybe next time we'll see if we figure out ways to sort of move the bottleneck a little more.
I love it. All right. Well, we're gonna try to get this into like a weekly cadence. It'll probably take 2 weeks to make that happen, but it's always good chit chatting
Always a
with you, and
pleasure.
look forward to doing it again more.
Great.